The ferry, a rust-streaked slab of metal groaning against the waves, deposited Dean onto a sliver of pockmarked concrete that served as the island's only dock. The air, thick with salt and a peculiar damp chill, immediately seeped into his bones. He was the sole disembarking passenger, his duffel bag slung heavy over his shoulder, a worn leather satchel clutched in his hand. The ferryman, a burly figure with a face like weathered stone, merely grunted a goodbye before the vessel's engines roared, churning the gray water as it pivoted and retreated into the shrouding fog. Dean watched it go, a dwindling silhouette, until the mist swallowed it whole, leaving him in a profound silence broken only by the mournful cry of unseen gulls. This was it. The island. His grandfather's legacy. His escape. He stood on the desolate dock for a long moment, the world pressing in, a heavy blanket of gray. Overhead, the sky was an unbroken expanse of low cloud, promising no sun, only more of this perpetual twilight. A narrow gravel track, barely more than a cart path, snaked its way up a gentle rise, disappearing into the swirling vapor. There were no welcoming lights, no distant hum of activity, just the vast, empty expanse of the sea and the unseen land. It felt less like an arrival and more like an exile. His cartographer's eye, usually so keen for contours and elevations, saw only an indistinct blur of rock and sparse, wind-stunted vegetation. The island offered no comforting landmarks, no familiar shapes to anchor his gaze. It was a blank slate, much like the future he was trying to sketch for himself, but infinitely more daunting. He started walking, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. The fog, an almost tangible presence, brushed against his face, leaving tiny beads of moisture on his eyelashes. Instead, he heard only the rhythmic, distant sigh of the ocean, a sound that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. After what felt like an hour, though it could have been 20 minutes in the thick visibility, a shape began to coalesce in the gloom ahead. It was the cottage, nestled precariously on a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea. The cottage was a grim testament to neglect. Its whitewash, once bright, was now flaking parchment, streaked with green mold and black grime. Several window panes were shattered, gaping holes like missing teeth. A rusted iron gate hung crookedly from a single hinge, groaning faintly in the imperceptible breeze. The small garden was a tangled wilderness of thorny bushes and weeds, their skeletal branches rattling like dry bones. A broken bird bath lay overturned, a forgotten sentinel. He walked up the short, cracked flagstone path to the front door, a heavy oak slab, scarred and weathered. He fumbled in his satchel for the key, a large, ornate iron thing his lawyer had given him, feeling the cold metal press into his palm. The lock groaned in protest, stiff from disuse, before finally yielding with a sharp, resonant clunk. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Damp earth, salt, something metallic, and an underlying scent that was vaguely organic, like old seaweed left to rot. It was a smell that spoke of deep, undisturbed decay. He stepped inside. The gloom was profound. What little light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a scene of utter disarray. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, thick as snow. Furniture, draped in ghostly white sheets, loomed like shrouded figures. A thin layer of grime coated every surface, a testament to years of abandonment. He pulled back a sheet from a small table near a window. Beneath it lay a stack of old charts, yellowed and brittle, his grandfather's meticulous hand visible in the faded ink. A compass, its brass tarnished, sat beside them, its needle stubbornly pointing north. He ran a finger over the smooth, cool metal, a fleeting connection to the man he'd barely known. As he moved deeper into the main living area, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound reached him. It wasn't the wind, nor the creak of old timber. It was a low, resonant hum, originating from somewhere beneath the house, or perhaps from the very bedrock of the island itself. It was too deep to be natural, too sustained to be a mere draft. He paused, holding his breath, his senses straining. The hum seemed to throb, a deep bass note that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He shook his head, dismissing it as the effect of the wind funneling through the broken windows, or the distant roar of the sea distorted by the fog. His mind, he told himself, was playing tricks, already affected by the isolation. But as he stood there, another sensation prickled at the edge of his awareness. He whipped his head around, his gaze snapping to the spot. Nothing. Only the swirling gray of the fog, pressing against the glass like a hungry ghost. He stared, unblinking, into the impenetrable mist, searching for any ripple, any disturbance. There was none. Yet a knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. The island, he realized, was not simply remote. It felt watchful. He was the sole disembarking passenger, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a worn rucksack on his back, and a cartographer's tube clutched in one hand. The journey from the mainland had been a blur of gray ocean and internal monologue, a relentless echo of what he'd left behind. Now the island loomed, a craggy silhouette against a sky the color of bruised plums. A single rough-hewn track, little more than a path worn into the sparse grass and shale, led away from the dock. It snaked upwards, disappearing into a shroud of rolling fog that perpetually hugged the island's higher elevations. The cottage, his new inheritance, lay nestled somewhere within that ethereal veil, beneath the skeletal finger of the abandoned lighthouse, a sentinel of rust and faded paint that occasionally pierced the low-hanging cloud cover. His grandfather's cottage, when he finally reached it, was exactly as he'd imagined: stoic, weather-beaten, and profoundly lonely. Its gray stones seemed to absorb the light, and the windows, grimy with salt spray, stared out like vacant eyes. He felt a strange mixture of relief and profound isolation. This was it. Solitude. The fresh start he craved. The first anomaly manifested that very evening. Dean had spent the afternoon clearing a path to the outhouse, his hands raw from pulling at stubborn weeds. As dusk bled into night, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo, he went to the cottage's small west-facing window, intending to watch the tide. He'd always found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the ocean. But the tide wasn't behaving as it should. It surged, not with the gentle lapping he expected on this calm evening, but with an aggressive, almost hungry reach, licking higher up the rocky shore than seemed natural. He watched, perplexed, for a long time. Just a strong current, he told himself. Or perhaps the island's unique topography creates unusual tidal patterns. He was a cartographer, a man of maps and measurements, and he sought logical explanations for everything. The sea was vast, unpredictable. It had its own rules. Over the next few days, the strange tides persisted, becoming a constant, unsettling backdrop to his efforts to make the cottage habitable. He scrubbed away layers of grime, aired out musty rooms, and tried to ignite a fire in the ancient hearth. They weren't distinct words, but an impression of sound, like a chorus of low, guttural humming, just beneath the threshold of understanding, carried on the wind that shrieked around the eaves. It was as if the very air itself was alive with a mournful, ancient lament. He stopped, holding his breath, straining to decipher them. The sound seemed to weave in and out of the wind's howl, a phantom melody. Isolation, he thought. It does strange things to the mind. Just the wind, whistling through loose boards, playing tricks. He returned to the window, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand, but a prickle of unease had begun to burrow under his skin. Later that week, while clearing out a small, cramped study that his grandfather had used, Dean found it. It was old, its leather cover warped and cracked, its pages swollen and discolored by what looked like extensive water damage. A faint, briny scent, almost like decay, emanated from it. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. The first few pages were standard log entries, notations on weather and lighthouse maintenance, written in his grandfather's familiar, precise hand. But then, the entries changed. The handwriting grew frantic, sprawling across the page, often bleeding into disturbing sketches. Dean's breath hitched. These weren't the neat, technical drawings of a lighthouse keeper. Shapes that defied natural order, all sinew and impossible angles, with a recurring motif of swirling water and obscured depths. Do not listen. The pact, the encroaching tide, they hear it. They feel it. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man, alone too long on a remote island. Grandfather was a lighthouse keeper after all, prone to isolation-induced delusions. These are just abstract imaginings, the product of a mind unmoored by solitude and the relentless roar of the sea. The deep song was merely a metaphor for the siren call of the ocean, nothing more. He stared at the journal, at the frantic lines, the impossible shapes, the desperate pleas. He looked from the water-damaged pages to the window, where the gray light of the island bled into the room. Outside, the ocean churned, its waves crashing against the shore with a deliberate, almost hungry rhythm. The strange behavior of the tide were not just tricks of the wind or peculiarities of the island. The cottage air, thick with the scent of damp wool and something vaguely metallic, clung to Dean. After the ferry's departure, the island had settled into a profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic shush of waves against the shore and the distant, mournful cry of a seabird. He'd spent the remainder of the day unpacking, his movements stiff and deliberate, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos that had become his life. The cottage was sparse, its furniture heavy and dark, but a small, cluttered study offered a glimmer of purpose. Shelves groaned under the weight of ancient tomes, their spines cracked, pages yellowed. This, he thought, was where his grandfather had retreated, a solitary mind charting unseen currents. His eyes fell upon a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless touches. It was the same one he'd briefly skimmed back on the mainland. Now, under the flickering glow of a battery-powered lantern, the cottage's electricity was sporadic at best. He opened it again. The handwriting, once an indecipherable scrawl, seemed to coalesce, the looping letters less chaotic. His grandfather had dismissed them as sailors' tales. Yet the entries grew more frequent, more agitated, his skepticism fraying at the edges. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured thing. He woke with a gasp, the taste of salt on his tongue, his heart hammering against his ribs. The first thing he noticed was the light. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from a crack in the floorboards near the hearth. He knelt, peering closer. It wasn't a trick of the lantern. A network of delicate phosphorescent filaments pulsed with a soft, green-blue light, like miniature constellations. Bioluminescent algae. He'd seen it on the shore, washing up in strands, but never inside a structure. His gaze tracked it, following its faint trail. A shiver traced its way down his spine. This was not natural. A nagging urge, born from the unsettling dreams in the journal's cryptic entries, pulled him towards the most prominent landmark on the island. After a meager breakfast of stale bread and instant coffee, Dean donned his heaviest coat, the wind already whipping at the cottage windows. He followed a barely discernible path, overgrown with hardy coastal flora, that wound its way up the craggy incline. The abandoned lighthouse stood sentinel on the highest bluff, a stark, weather-beaten tower against the bruised sky. Its white paint had long since peeled, leaving patches of raw, gray stone exposed. The glass in its lantern room was shattered, jagged teeth against the horizon. A rusted iron door, hanging precariously on a single hinge, groaned in the wind, a mournful lament. Inside, the air was still and heavy, thick with the scent of decay and salt-laden dust. The The spiral staircase, its metal treads slick with grime, ascended into gloom. Each step he took sent a creak through the ancient structure, amplified by the confined space. He imagined his grandfather, a younger man, climbing these very stairs, perhaps whistling a tune, oblivious to the secrets that would one day consume him. He reached a small, circular room below the lantern chamber. Here, debris lay scattered. Broken glass, rusted tools, and a stack of what looked like old logbooks, their covers swollen and warped by years of damp. He picked one up, brushing away the grit. It was a lighthouse keeper's record, meticulously detailing weather conditions, ship sightings, and supply deliveries. But further back, the entries changed. The handwriting, still his grandfather's, grew frantic, hurried. Storms unlike any I've witnessed. The sea, it sings. The deep stirs, I hear it, feel it. They speak of a pact. A forgotten bargain. A pact. The word resonated with the fragmented entries in his grandfather's personal journal back at the cottage. He flipped more pages, his fingers trembling. His grandfather had not been merely reclusive. He had been a man unraveling, cornered by something unspeakable. The algae, the dreams, the journal, the logbook. They were all pieces of a mosaic, depicting a picture far more terrifying than he could have imagined. The word pact echoed in Dean's mind, a dark chime against the persistent roar of the ocean. His grandfather hadn't just kept a record of the lighthouse's operations. He had documented a losing battle, a desperate series of actions taken against an encroaching horror. The sheer weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavy as the island's perpetual fog. He laid the journal on the sturdy oak table, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of anxious handling. His gaze drifted to the window, where the gray expanse of the sea merged seamlessly with the overcast sky. The air in the cottage, usually still and heavy with the scent of salt and old paper, now seemed to vibrate with a low, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't the wind, nor the distant drone of a boat. It was deeper, resonating in his teeth, a sound he felt rather than heard, like the slow, grinding shift of forgotten tectonic plates beneath the ocean floor. He walked to the kitchen, intending to brew strong tea, but paused at the threshold. A small ceramic mug, one he'd left on the counter, now rested inches from where he remembered placing it, closer to the edge. He stared at it, a prickle of unease tracing a path up his spine. Had he moved it absent-mindedly? He was meticulous, almost pathologically so, a trait honed by years of precise cartography. No, he hadn't. A faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across rough wood, emanated from the living room. Dean's breath hitched. He moved slowly, deliberately toward the sound. The hum intensified, a low thrum against his eardrums. Nothing. Just the familiar, heavy furniture, the dusty bookshelves, the portrait of his stoic grandfather staring out from the mantelpiece. Then he saw it. A small, antique compass, usually kept on a high shelf, lay on the floor near the hearth, its brass casing dulled, its needle spinning wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. He hadn't touched that compass in days. This wasn't just his imagination. This was active. He bent to pick up the compass, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. As he straightened, his reflection caught in the small, ornate mirror above the mantelpiece. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, the face staring back wasn't quite his own. The distortion vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only his own pale, frightened features. He blinked, shaking his head, trying to dislodge the image. He knew what he'd seen, even if his mind immediately tried to reject it. He went back to the logbook, flipping through its later entries, looking for clues beyond the despairing scrawl. He ran his hand along the spine, feeling a slight give in the leather. Curiosity overriding fear, he pressed harder, and a small, hidden compartment sprang open, revealing a shallow recess. Dean's fingers trembled as he picked up the idol. It depicted a grotesque, multi-limbed figure, its features indistinct, its form vaguely aquatic. He recognized similar symbols from the margins of his grandfather's more frantic journal entries, crude attempts to replicate the entity's form, perhaps. This was it then. Evidence of his grandfather's desperate attempts to ward off whatever lurked beyond the shore, perhaps even to offer it tribute. The dried matter, the idol, were these tokens of sacrifice? His grandfather hadn't just been documenting, he'd been performing. The hum swelled, a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated through the cottage, rattling the window panes. Dean felt an irrational pull toward the sea, a siren song woven into the very fabric of the air. He resisted, his mind screaming at him to stay put, to lock himself away. But the hum, it was hypnotic, insidious. He found himself walking, drawn by an invisible current, to the back door, which led to a small, overgrown path toward the cliffs. He reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. He pushed the door open, a blast of briny air hitting him, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the immediate surroundings, half expecting to see some tangible manifestation. And then he saw it. It shimmered, a viscous, aqueous mass, reflecting no light, absorbing it all. It was vaguely tall, impossibly slender, and for a terrifying moment, Dean felt an intense, crushing pressure, as if the very air had turned to liquid around him, trying to pull him down, down into its depths. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the porch step, sending him sprawling into the cottage entryway. He scrambled backward, crab-like, until his back hit the opposite wall, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The hum, though still present, receded to a bearable drone. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his temples. He had seen it. It was real. And it was here. He scrambled backward, crab-like, until his back hit the cold, rough plaster of the cottage wall. His breath hitched, a ragged thing caught in his throat. The memory of the distorted shape, the impossible angles just beyond the back door, etched itself onto the inside of his eyelids. It had been brief, a flicker, but undeniable. Not a trick of the light, not a shadow. Something wrong. He was alone, utterly alone on this remote island, and whatever he had seen, whatever had been stirring beneath the waves, was now pressing against the very edges of his perception. He needed answers, and there was only one place left to look. With a shuddering exhale, he pushed himself upright, his muscles stiff, his knees weak. The grandfather's journal lay on the small, scarred table where he'd left it, an unassuming leather-bound book that now felt like a lead weight, pregnant with terrible knowledge. He snatched it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped to the last entries he hadn't yet deciphered. The script grew more frantic here, the ink smudged in places as if the writer's hand had shaken. Dean squinted at the faded pages, his mind racing to connect the dots. The grandfather had started using more symbols, intricate patterns that looked like twisted knots or ancient runes, interspersed with his increasingly sparse words. The tides obey the call, a rhythm not of the sea, but of the deep. It learns, it waits. Dean read aloud, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet cottage. He traced a symbol that looked like a jagged, inverted trident. The pact holds, but the strain. The song grows louder. It demands sustenance. Sustenance? Dean's stomach churned. What could the grandfather have meant? He reread the passage, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't just observation anymore. The tone had shifted from detached recording to something far more intimate, more desperate. His grandfather hadn't merely witnessed the creeping malevolence. He had been involved. He had been fighting it, perhaps even feeding it. The deep song. The journal mentioned it repeatedly in these later entries, describing it as a siren call, a melody of madness that twisted the mind. Dean tried to focus on the next entry, but the words blurred, swimming on the page. The cottage itself seemed to hum with it, the wooden floorboards vibrating subtly beneath his bare feet. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the sound persisted, a constant, insidious drone. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the clamminess of his skin. Had he slept at all last night? He couldn't remember. The lines between reality and the bizarre imaginings of his exhausted mind were beginning to fray. He gripped the journal tighter, his knuckles white. This wasn't just stress. This was what his grandfather had written about. This was the entity's influence, reaching out, touching his sanity. The light falters. The guardians weaken. The blood. It binds. Dean's eyes darted across the page, his breath catching. Blood? What kind of ritual had his grandfather been involved in? The thought made his skin crawl. He remembered the faint, coppery scent that sometimes clung to the cottage air, the inexplicable stains on the old wooden beams. Then, a small, intricate drawing caught his attention. It wasn't a symbol, but a crude, almost childlike sketch of the abandoned lighthouse. Below it, a series of arrows pointed downwards, converging on a single X-marked spot at the base. Beneath the X, a single word was scrawled, almost illegible. Crypt. The hum in the air pulsed, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like the island itself was breathing, a monstrous slow inhale and exhale. Dean looked up, his gaze drawn toward the window, but the thick fog outside revealed nothing but swirling gray. He felt a profound sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand, to stop whatever was happening. He grabbed the old lantern from the mantelpiece, its glass chimney dull with grime, and fumbled for matches. The flame sputtered to life, casting an unsteady, jaundiced glow. The journal's cryptic drawing was a command, a desperate plea from the past. He had to go to the abandoned lighthouse. Now. The short walk was a blur of fog and the relentless hum that seemed to grow with every step. Its stone walls, usually a stark contrast to the sky, now seemed to melt into the gray, a sentinel of forgotten horrors. He pushed open the heavy iron door, its hinges groaning like a tortured beast. The interior was a spiral of damp, cold stone, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. He followed the crude map from the journal, his lantern beam dancing ahead of him, illuminating the worn steps and peeling paint. The X mark, the crypt designation, pointed not to the base of the tower itself, but to a section of the foundation that merged with the natural rock face. He found it behind a crumbling section of wall, obscured by fallen debris and years of neglect. A heavy stone slab, almost perfectly flush with the ground, but with a faint carved symbol on its surface, the same inverted trident from the journal. It took all his strength, grunting and straining, to pry it open. The slab scraped against the rough stone with a sound that grated on his teeth, revealing a yawning blackness beneath. The deep song intensified, becoming a tangible pressure, a resonant vibration that seemed to pluck at the very fibers of his being. He could feel it now. The pull. This wasn't just a chamber. This was a grave. And his grandfather had been here, down there, performing whatever ritual kept the monstrous thing dormant. Dean swallowed hard, his throat dry. A profound sense of urgency, a desperate need for answers, clawed at Dean. The hum, no longer just an ambient vibration, had become a physical pressure against his eardrums, a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones. It felt like the island itself was a vast ancient drum, and he stood upon its skin, feeling every beat. He didn't know what he sought, only that it lay beyond the familiar, that the answer was not in his cottage, nor in the well-worn paths he'd charted. It was out there, in the swirling gray, beckoning. He snatched his heavy oilskin coat from the hook, the damp wool surprisingly comforting against the chill that seemed to seep from the very air. The door groaned open, revealing a world swallowed by fog. The familiar path to the cliff edge was gone, replaced by an indistinct swirl of gray that pressed in, thick and cloying. Each step was an act of faith, the ground beneath his boots a muffled, uncertain thing. The air tasted of salt and something else, a metallic tang, like old blood or ozone that prickled the back of his throat. The hum grew louder, guiding him. He stumbled over unseen roots, the damp earth sucking at his boots, but he pressed on, his gaze fixed on nothing but the hazy outline of the cliff ahead. The ocean's roar, usually a constant companion, was muted, swallowed by the fog, replaced by the relentless thrumming. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, where he was being drawn. The silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse emerged from the gloom, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the sky. It was taller, more menacing than he remembered, its stone face scarred by decades of wind and salt. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the very air, rattling the loose panes in the lighthouse windows. He pushed the heavy, salt-encrusted door, but the hum was strongest at the base, emanating from the stone floor itself. Not a crack, but a perfectly cut line, almost invisible beneath layers of grime and neglect. With a surge of adrenaline, Dean pushed. The section of wall, heavier than he expected, grated inward with a terrible grinding sound, revealing a narrow, pitch-black opening. A blast of frigid, stagnant air rushed out, carrying with it that cloying, metallic scent. This was it, the threshold. He fumbled for the lantern he always carried in his coat pocket, igniting the wick with a trembling thumb. Dean descended, each step echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was not an artifact, not a portal, but something in between, something that defied easy classification. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of an impossible geometry. And then, it reached for him. Not with physical tendrils, but with something far more insidious. A vision, sharp and brutal, tore through his mind. He saw the island, not as a solitary landmass, but as a small, fragile thing, tethered by an unseen umbilical cord to something vast and unknowable beneath the waves. He saw the pulsating mass in the chamber grow, its tendrils reaching out, not just into the black pool, but through the very stone of the island, spreading like a malignant root system. The vision was not of death, but of absorption, of being made utterly, utterly null. He felt the immense, ancient power, the terrible, slow intent behind it all. It wanted the island. The vision snapped shut, leaving him gasping, clutching his chest. The air in the chamber felt thick, heavy with the entity's presence. He had sought answers, and now he had them. The hum returned, not from the walls, but from deep within himself, a resonance with the terrible thing before him, a terrifying communion he could not escape. The island itself was a vast ancient drum, and he stood upon its skin. The hum, once a distant drone, now resonated not just in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. It was a physical pressure, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to loosen the fillings in his teeth, to make his vision blur at the edges. Dean staggered, gripping the cold, salt-scoured railing of the spiral staircase in the abandoned lighthouse. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of brine and something else. Something metallic and cold, like old blood mixed with ozone. It wasn't just an external force anymore. It was an internal one. He fought it, a desperate, silent battle waged on the precipice of his consciousness. His head throbbed, a drumbeat matching the island's own, amplifying the entity's insidious pull. This wasn't just about the island, or the cottage, or the encroaching fog. This was about him. He gasped, a strangled sound, and the vision snapped back, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. No, he wouldn't let it. A spark of defiance, fueled by a primal fear of annihilation, ignited within him. His gaze darted to the worn, leather-bound journal clutched in his trembling hand. It was his only hope, the only link to the grandfather who had faced this same horror. He stumbled down the remaining steps, his legs feeling like lead, and collapsed onto the dusty floor of the lighthouse's base. The hum here was deafening, a roar that vibrated through the very stone, making the ancient structure groan and shift. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the thick glass of the lantern room high above, wind howling like a tormented beast. But the sounds of the tempest were distant, secondary to the resonant thrumming that threatened to unravel his sanity. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the journal's clasp. He tore through the pages, ignoring the faded script, the detailed maps, the weather observations. He needed answers, not history. He flipped past his grandfather's increasingly frantic entries, past the warnings about the deep collar, past the desperate pleas for understanding. He searched for a solution, a method, anything. Then, buried deep within the latter half of the book, he found it. A series of pages, hastily scribbled, some crossed out, others barely legible. It wasn't a neat, organized plan. It was a desperate, fragmented account of a ritual, a last resort. The words were archaic, steeped in forgotten lore, describing symbols and offerings, a complex arrangement of specific objects, and a precise alignment of natural forces. To sever the tendrils, a binding of blood and bone, a sacrifice of what is held most dear. Dean's eyes scanned the words, his breath catching in his throat. It spoke of a temporary sealing, not a permanent eradication. A method to push it back, to force it into dormancy. But the cost? The words grew clearer on the next page, stark and terrifying. The resonance must be countered. The gate closed from within. A life for a lifetime. The heart offered to the deep. He froze, the journal slipping in his grasp. It was a sacrifice, not just of an object, but of a life. A conscious, willing offering. His own life. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He had understood this. He had known the cost. This wasn't a way to save the island from the entity. It was a way to save himself from its embrace, at the ultimate price. Dean stared at the page, the ancient script blurring. He was trapped. Trapped on an island that was slowly being consumed, in a lighthouse that was vibrating apart, and with a monstrous presence trying to tear his mind to shreds. And the only way out, the only path to stopping it, demanded everything. His determination wavered, battling with a profound, soul-deep despair. The hum intensified, a triumphant roar now, as if the entity knew the terrible truth he had just uncovered. It knew his fear, and it savored it. The journal, damp with the sea-kissed air of the abandoned lighthouse, slid against Dean's trembling fingers. It was a sacrifice. The sentence ended abruptly, a cruel ellipsis of faded ink. He didn't need the rest. The implication hung in the frigid air, thick and suffocating. A sacrifice. Not just a life, but his life, perhaps. Or something inextricably linked to it. A piece of himself he hadn't yet realized was forfeit. The abandoned lighthouse groaned around him, a mournful sound swallowed by the sudden, violent surge of the storm outside. It wasn't a typical squall. The wind howled with a malicious intelligence, rattling the thick glass of the lantern room, a sound like 1,000 voices screaming through shattered teeth. Rain lashed against the ancient stone, but it wasn't just water. It felt heavy, viscous, like liquid shadow flung from the churning abyss. He pressed his face against a pane, peering out into the maelstrom. What he saw twisted his gut into a knot of cold dread. It coiled around the base of the tower, tendrils snaking inland, obscuring the familiar contours of the island. Where the shoreline met the tumultuous sea, the waves weren't breaking in white foam, but in a sickly, phosphorescent green, like bile churned from the ocean's depths. And the sound. It was the entity, asserting its presence, its immense psychic pressure manifesting in the physical world. He pulled back, his breath misting. The air inside the abandoned lighthouse had grown heavy, laden with the scent of ozone and something else. A deep, briny decay, like the smell of a forgotten shipwreck dragged up from the crushing pressure of the deep. It wasn't just in his mind. It was in the very stones of the tower, in the salt-crusted air he breathed. He forced himself to reread the last legible pages of his grandfather's journal. It wasn't about destroying the entity. The journal made it clear. The thing was ancient, a force of nature, beyond mortal comprehension or destruction. The ritual required a confluence of specific elements: the peak of the storm, the deepest point of the tide, and... Dean's gaze snagged on that phrase again. His grandfather had sketched a crude diagram on the final page, a circle bisected by a jagged line with a single, small, irregular shape at its center. It looked disturbingly like a human heart, but rendered with a primitive, almost tribal simplicity. Beneath it, a single word, underscored thrice. Memory. Memory? What did memory have to do with it? He flipped back through the earlier pages, his fingers flying, seeking context, a missing piece of the puzzle. Not life, not necessarily, but self. The core of one's being. A profound emotional offering. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the abandoned lighthouse. A low, grinding groan echoed from below, as if the very foundations were being torn asunder. Dean stumbled, catching himself on the heavy railing of the spiral staircase. He looked out again, his eyes widening. The island was changing. Along the cliff face, the familiar gray rock had begun to weep. Not water, but a thick black ichor that oozed from fissures, glistening wetly in the unnatural green light. Further down, near the water's edge, something moved. Shapes, indistinct in the swirling chaos, but too large, too irregular to be mere rocks. They seemed to heave, to pulse. The shoreline itself appeared to be in flux, the sand and shingle churning, forming grotesque, fleeting structures that dissolved back into the muck, only to reform anew. Twisted, barnacled protrusions, like skeletal fingers, clawed their way out of the churning surf, reaching, grasping. This wasn't merely a storm, it was the world itself responding to a colossal, unseen will. The journal's final cryptic clues were all he had. The counter-ritual. It was a desperate gamble, a pact with forces beyond his comprehension, but the alternative was annihilation. Not just of himself, but of everything he knew. Everything that made the world recognizable. The cost, he now understood, was not just his life, but his self, his memories, perhaps even his sanity. To offer his heart to the deep, to sacrifice memory, it implied a stripping away, an emptying. He would not die, perhaps, but what would remain? The old man's scrawled words, though faded, seemed to pulse with a faint internal light. The ritual required specific tools, specific actions, a journey to a precise point at the lowest tide, where the entity's influence was strongest, where the veil between worlds was thinnest. He looked around the lantern room, his gaze settling on the sturdy, rusted winch, the heavy iron chain that once lowered the lamp for maintenance. Practicality asserted itself amidst the burgeoning horror. He needed to be ready for anything. The roar of the storm outside intensified, a crescendo of ancient rage and boundless hunger. Dean took a deep, shuddering breath, the briny, decaying air filling his lungs. He would face it. He would offer the sacrifice. He would, somehow, put this ancient evil back to sleep, even if it meant losing himself in the process. There was no one else. And the island, his grandfather's legacy, was already too far gone. It was a sacrifice. The sentence ended abruptly, a cruel ellipsis of faded ink, but the meaning, cold and sharp as a sliver of ice, had finally clicked into place. He understood. His grandfather's desperate bargain, the price of containing the encroaching darkness. And now, the bill was due. A low thrum vibrated through the very bones of the abandoned lighthouse. It wasn't the wind, nor the waves, but something deeper. A resonant hum that seemed to emanate from beneath the stone foundations, from the bedrock itself. The air, already heavy with salt and decay, grew impossibly dense, pressing against his eardrums, making his breath shallow. A faint, acrid scent, like ozone mixed with ancient brine and something metallic, began to permeate the tower. Dean gripped the journal, his knuckles white. This wasn't just about the island anymore, or the forgotten pact. The light in the chamber, already dim, began to warp. The single grimy window overlooking the churning sea seemed to twist, its glass rippling as if seen through heated air. Outside, the fog, which had been a distant shroud, now pressed against the glass, a living, breathing wall of gray. But within its depths, he could discern impossible movements, vast, indistinct shapes that coiled and writhed. "Let go, Dean," it seemed to hiss, the voice like sand grinding on rock, like the ocean dragging stones across the seabed. "Join us. All pain will cease." He staggered, clutching his head, fighting the invasion. The grief, so long a dull ache, flared into searing agony. The entity was probing, seeking weakness, trying to drown him in his own sorrow. "No," Dean choked out, his voice raw, barely audible against the growing thrum. He pushed back, focusing on the journal's final words, on the sacrifice. The thrum intensified, becoming a roar that vibrated through his teeth, rattling the very lenses in his eyes. The floor beneath his feet seemed to undulate. From the center of the abandoned lighthouse chamber, where the old mechanism for the lamp once stood, the air shimmered, then tore. It wasn't a physical tear, but a rent in the fabric of reality itself. This was the portal. This was the opening. It was the entity, fully manifested, pushing through the barrier, its tendrils of influence already coiling around his mind. The psychological attacks intensified. He felt his memories being flayed, his hopes twisted into grotesque parodies. He saw himself, alone, adrift, worthless. The entity wanted him to break, to surrender. But Dean wouldn't. Not now. He had come too far. He had understood too much. His gaze fell upon the rough, uneven stone altar his grandfather had built, the one he'd dismissed as an eccentric's folly. It was covered in faded, strange symbols, etched deep into the rock. This was where the heart was offered. This was where the pact had been renewed, time and again. And this was where it would be sealed, for good. He knew what the heart offered to the deep meant. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a life, given willingly, to satisfy the ancient hunger, to sate it just enough to force it back, to seal the tearing between worlds. His own life. This was the profound personal sacrifice he had to make. With a grunt, Dean pulled a sharp, weathered knife from his pack, a tool he'd brought for simple tasks, now destined for something horrific. His hand trembled, not from fear of the blade, but from the magnitude of the choice. The entity roared, a silent mental clamor of triumph and fury, sensing his intent, battling against it. It wanted him to break, to be consumed, not to offer himself on his own terms. He stepped towards the altar, each footfall heavy, deliberate. The portal pulsed, a hungry black wound in the world. Dean closed his eyes for a moment, picturing his loved one, a final, clear image, free from the entity's corruption. He placed his hand over his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his own heart. This was it. This was the price. The final act began. He raised the knife, the cold steel reflecting the impossible dark that pulsed and writhed before him. The entity's shriek, a sound that ripped at the fabric of his consciousness, still echoed, but Dean pushed through it. His hand, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around the hilt. This wasn't about vengeance, not anymore. It was about severing, about a price. He didn't plunge the blade into himself, though the thought had been a chilling whisper in the darkest corners of his fear. Instead, with a primal roar that tore his throat raw, he slammed the knife down, not into the formless horror, but into the ancient, salt-encrusted stone of the abandoned lighthouse floor. The point struck a deeply carved, almost invisible symbol. A spiraling glyph his grandfather had meticulously hidden beneath layers of grime and neglect. It was the heart of the pact, the anchor point, the locus of the deep song. A tremor, violent and guttural, ripped through the entire structure. The air shivered, thick and cloying like inhaling brine and static. Dean felt a searing jolt, not physical, but a psychic backlash that slammed into his skull, scattering his thoughts like startled birds. He crumpled, the knife still quivering, embedded in the stone. The impossible dark before him didn't vanish. It simply retreated. It coalesced, shrinking, condensing into a point of profound, abyssal blackness that pulsed once, twice, then winked out of existence, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and the damp, cold air of the lighthouse. Dean lay gasping, his body aching as if he'd been pressed under a colossal weight. His eyes, stinging from the psychic assault, slowly adjusted to the dim, natural light filtering through the grimy windows of the abandoned lighthouse. The immediate threat, the screaming, encroaching entity, had been neutralized. But the cost... He pushed himself up, his limbs leaden. He looked at the knife, still sunk to its hilt in the stone. It was the entity's essence, its tether to this world, slowly bleeding out. As he did, a new sensation bloomed in his mind, not an invasion, but an awareness. It was the deep song, still there, but muted, distant. It was no longer a threat. It was a constant, inescapable hum, a resonance within his very bones. His grandfather, he realized, hadn't merely abandoned the lighthouse. He had abandoned his post. This knife, this glyph, this terrible act hadn't just driven the entity back. It had transferred the burden. The pact wasn't broken. It had merely found a new guardian. Dean was now inextricably linked, the island's unwilling sentinel. He walked to the window, his movements stiff, as if his muscles had forgotten their purpose. The fog, thick and impenetrable, still clung to the island, erasing the horizon, blurring the line between sea and sky. The island, once a refuge, had become a cage. He could feel its pulse, a slow, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of his own tired heart. He wasn't free. He was bound. He understood now. His grandfather had fled, driven mad by the weight of this knowledge, by the endless song. Dean felt the stirrings of that madness already, a creeping tendril of despair that threatened to unravel his sanity. He tried to imagine leaving, walking away from the abandoned lighthouse, taking the ferry back to the mainland. The world beyond this fog-shrouded rock felt distant, unreal. How could he return to a life of maps and mundane concerns when his mind now contained the echo of the deep? He was the guardian now. The deep song had found its new singer. The future was not a blank slate, but an endless, fog-bound vigil.